Thanks for coming here on this blustery morning, which makes me think of the childhood story of Christopher Robin and the blustery day. But I couldn't be telling you that story in China today, because that involves Winnie the Pooh. And Winnie the Pooh has been recently used as a meme for Xi Jinping, the leader of China. Some people felt that he looked like Winnie the Pooh, and then there's a picture of him with Shinzo Abe, the Prime Minister of Japan, who they had the meme of him as Eeyore. So it's Eeyore and Winnie the Pooh. But it was interesting, and it's an interesting take in thinking about China, that shortly thereafter, Winnie the Pooh and caricatures of Winnie the Pooh were made illegal in China, and people can be arrested for using that on the internet, particularly with Xi Jinping. So as I was driving down here, and I actually going into the parking lot at Lincoln in my umbrella, did the reverse thing. I was thinking of Christopher Robin and then our good leader in China, Mr. Xi Jinping. Okay, so we have about an hour, and I'm going to do 45 minutes. I'm one of those people that I could talk for 3 hours on this, so I'll try to condense this a little bit so that I have time for questions. The first part of this I'd like to talk about is a little bit of history of China in terms of their educational system and where they began. Because as a nation and as a culture, it has a very long-standing tradition of education. And it dates back about 2,200 years to the beginning of the Han Dynasty. We all know the Qin Dynasty, largely because of some of the things that happened during the Qin. One of which is the terracotta warriors that were built for the grave for the Qin Emperor. And a lot of other things that the Qin Emperor did was to try to make China standardized. Weights and measures, everything was going to be the same. The distance, the Chinese mile, the li was going to be the same. Different writing systems were regionalized. They made the writing system standardized. Laws were standardized and brutal, I might add. It's called Confucian legalism. And a lot of these things happened during the Qin, and actually Qin is the word where we get China. That's the word when we think of first identified, and it becomes through the Silk Road in Rome. That's where we get the idea of the word and the transliteration for China. The Qin was also the shortest dynasty of dynastic China. Chinese dynasties typically run anywhere from 300 to 800 years in length. Qin ran 14. The first Qin emperor dies at about 208 BC, and his son, not quite as fearful. People aren't afraid of him as much. Everybody before was terrified of his father, and within 4 years he was overthrown. And they created a new dynasty which was called the Han. And the Han dynasty followed many of the practices of the Qin, except for the brutality part. The Qin, the idea of the Great Wall, let's put a lot of people, if you die, we'll put you in the wall, don't worry about it, that sort of thing. The Han dynasty of the first emperor says, let's redistribute the land, give all the peasants 10 acres. You can work the land. What happened then? Productivity went way up, population went way up, wealth went way up, everybody was really happy. He also wanted to prevent competition. And the competition that he wanted to prevent was the warrior classes that had developed during the late previous dynasties. And so he said, our power structure is not based on your ability to fight, but your ability to think. And created for the first time what was called the examination system. And did a series of examinations to determine who was going to be the local leaders, the regional leaders, and eventually the leaders at court. And these individuals were known as scholar officials, we call them in English. They get called often popular characterization mandarins. We use the term mandarins. And the mandarins, or scholar officials, would study very specifically a body of knowledge. And that body of knowledge was the classics. And the classics were writings from 600 years previously, from the spring and autumn period, which was 700 BCE. The Analects of Confucius, the writings of Mencius. And to pass the exam, you needed to memorize all of these things. Then you also needed to memorize all the commentary on all of the things. And they would give you the exam at the local level, and you would attempt to pass the test. It took about 5 years of intensive study if you were a very good person, and you had to have a certain degree of wealth to pass the first level. It took another 5 to 10 years to get to the next level. And usually, if people made it to the top level, they had done about 40 to 50 years of study to be that person, that top level of scholar official. And so it was meritocracy based upon knowledge around this body of knowledge, which is very specific, but also in the past. And as officials, they were supposed to judge and make decisions based upon, you know, there's the popular thing in the 1990s, I guess, and even 10 years ago, the plastic wristband. What would Jesus do among the Christian community? It was almost, what would Confucius do? And they would look at the decision and say, how does this fit within Confucian thinking? And so oftentimes people talk about, as teachers, we talk about the idea of wanting to make a decision as a scholar official is like looking in your car in the rear view mirror. You're looking forward to look backwards. And you try to make that decision by looking in the past. Which is very thoughtful, which is very deliberate, which is also very conservative. So change doesn't happen very quickly. So, and I could, this is how you can see how I can get trapped into talking for about 6 to 8 hours. And I'm not going to do it. So you can see how the dynasties can go for 400, 600 years. And they did. And they do break down. And they have failings and they break down. And so you go through the Han Dynasty and breaks down 400 years later. You have 300 years of civil war in which 2/3 of the population drops by 2/3. And you go into the Tong Dynasty, which I always like to say is Kyle Tong was the greatest dynasty of all China. And there's a lot of good cases to say that. But the Tong Dynasty, which is a very strong time, also notable to being the only time that a woman was emperor of China, Empress Wu. She had to change the religion of court to Buddhism to justify, because otherwise you could not have a woman be a leader. And then the Confucian Mandarins changed that very quickly as soon as she died, back to the traditional system. Then the Song Dynasty. And then a really good case in point of how the Confucianism probably really negatively affected China just as globalism was beginning. And that was in the 1300s. There was a gentleman by the name of Zhang He. Anyone ever heard of this? He was a mariner, a shipbuilder and a traveler. And he was able to, he had the favor of the emperor and the imperial court to build very large ships. And his ships that he was able to build, this is the mid to late 1300s, were about 100 meters in length. Think about that. 1300s. Huge. It also denuded much of the trees of southeast China in the process. And so there's no trees. Old growth is gone. But they were able to build this kind of armada of ships in which, over a 50-year period, they traveled Southeast Asia that we know for sure. There's these theories that they traveled to Australia and to America and other places. But what's known for sure, Southeast Asia, India, East Africa. And he brought back, and the emperor was quite impressed, with a couple of giraffes. And so, at the Forbidden City, there were a couple of giraffes roaming around the imperial court until wintertime, and then things went badly for the giraffe. But Zhang He was bringing China out to the world. And this was really kind of significant, because what's happening in the mid-1300s in Europe? Mid-1300s.
Renaissance.
Reformation.
Black Death. Get to the mid-1400s, early 1400s, things are starting to turn. But in the mid-1300s, they're kind of a low point. Kind of a low point in Europe. And both in terms of ability to defend itself, ability to interact, ability to trade. And here's China going out in the world. What do you think the Mandarins thought of that? Rearview mirror. We don't want to go out in the world, because what does our language actually mean? What does China mean? Middle Kingdom. We are the center of the universe. We don't go out to the world comes to us. So why should we be doing this? So he came back. About a year later, there was lightning hit the Forbidden City. There was a fire. The Mandarins say, this is the gods telling us that we shouldn't be going out in the world. The emperor agrees with them. They burn all the boats, and they burn all the plans. And China no longer studies or does any travel across the oceans again. They wish they had them come 1840s, when the British showed up during the Opium War and defeated them heavily during the Navy. Flashing forward to that point, they didn't have that ability. The British defeated them handily because of the lack of technology, and suddenly China was being treated as an inferior state. And again, I'm skipping about 6 hours of lecture here. So, and China is suddenly seen as this country of the have-nots. Where it's interesting, because think about the mythology of the 1400s. What was Spain wanting to do? They wanted to go to Cathay, that mythical place where all the great things are. And 500 years later, this is what we were told at the dinner table starting in the early 20th century. Eat all of your food, because there are starving children in China. So China had gone down the pecking order in a huge way. Which, again, flashing forward to the early 20th century, China had been infiltrated by the West in a lot of different ways. You had the extraterritoriality treaties, in which unfair trade treaties, in which we had open trade ports, US, Britain, Germany, France, in which we were able to freely trade and extract wealth. We also brought a number of missionaries into China, trying to convert towards Christianity. But the other thing that was happening with that was education, and a different sort of education than the Mandarins. Because they were bringing education and the idea of possibly second language. They were also bringing education in science, mathematics, philosophy, history, a number of different areas. But particularly the things that took for people was science and government. Science and government. And so you started to have basically two generations of people amongst middle-class Chinese that started to think, we don't want to be dynastic China anymore. And again, long story short, dynastic China ends in 1912, and China is in a bit of a chaos. And then in 1919, a spark happens. And that spark is known as the May 4th movement. And the May 4th movement was predicated on the Versailles Treaty. On May 4th, 1919, people got into the streets and rallied and said, no more. Because what had happened at Versailles? Germany had possessions in China. Germany had possessions throughout the world. And one of the things they agreed is to give up Germany's possessions. They lost at the war. Who did they give Germany's possessions to? Japan. It didn't go over real well amongst the Chinese, because actually within the previous 20 years they had lost the island of Taiwan in the Sino-Japanese War in the 1890s. And now all of a sudden they're not even sitting at the table. So here's China saying we are second class. We weren't even allowed to be at the Versailles Treaty, and then giving up our territory. And China was livid. And this really triggered that sense of Chinese nationalism and really brought about modern Chinese nationalism. Whereas Chinese nationalism in the classical sense of dynastic China was you had this son of heaven who's providing for you. This Chinese nationalism in the 20th century is we are a people, we have an identity, and we collectively need to take responsibility for this. Around this new culture movement came this belief around new ideas. And they started to talk about uncles. We have these uncles. One uncle is named that we need to promote. His name is Mr. Science. We have another uncle. His name is Mr. Democracy. The third uncle that we need to get rid of is Mr. Confucius. So they want Mr. Confucius to be gone. And I argue that there was a fourth uncle sitting in the weeds, and that was Mr. Socialism. But he was not quite there in 1918, but he was in some of the thoughts of people, particularly a young Mao Zedong, who was involved with the leader of the New Culture movement, who eventually becomes the first leader of nationalist China, Sun Yat-sen. And Sun Yat-sen creates the Republic of China, and he has 2 lieutenants underneath him, and they were like brothers. Chiang Kai-shek and Mao Zedong. Very close to each other. And if you like biblical tales, it's a classic biblical tale. It's a Cain and Abel story. Mao Zedong and Chiang Kai-shek. As soon as Papa died, Chiang Kai-shek goes after Mao and chases him for about 8 years until the Japanese chase both of them and they unite briefly. And one of the things the West misunderstood was thinking that that conflict was over when the Japanese invaded and that they united to repel the Japanese in World War II. That conflict was put on hold. You think of the Chinese psyche, look in the rearview mirror, we're patient, we'll wait. And the United States made the mistake in '46 of pulling out very quickly, whereas Moscow did not pull out at all. And that was certainly a definite advantage tactically for Mao Zedong to take over, and basically October 1, 1949, the People's Republic of China is declared. Mao, when he takes power in 1949, takes over a country that is primarily rural, primarily peasant, has a literacy rate of 20%. When, by 2010, the literacy rate in China is 97%. So if you think about some of the demographics and things that change over time, things move very quickly. Mao, and again, here's another 6 hours of brush. Very quickly, you have the Cultural Revolution, Maoism, and the Little Red Book. First 10 years go pretty standard in the sense of nation building, a lot of creation, schools are developed, full access for students, and this is where you start seeing that literacy rate. It actually followed a lot of the Han ideas of redistribution of land. Land production goes up. Then, and I'm going to say this really quickly, they started going to collectives. The collectives were a disaster. They caused a great famine. As a result of the famine, there was a lot of finger pointing. As a result of the finger pointing, Mao then cleaned house and called for the young people to purify the party. And that was the beginning of the Cultural Revolution, which ran from 1966 to his death in 1976. It was a leveling of China. Think about having middle schoolers and young high schoolers running your country. That's what it was. They, I don't like you. You can think about the Salem witch trials, all of those sorts of things that was going on. And Mao pointed them in the direction. They read out of the Little Red Book. Many were killed. Many were re-educated. The leadership was taken out. It was very important that one of them survived, and that was Deng Xiaoping, who then became the leader after Mao died. But it was a huge upheaval. But the facade of society continued. You continued to go to school, but you read from the Little Red Book. Okay, we're in geography class now. Okay, this is geography. Okay, let's read from page 349 of the Little Red Book. Okay, you're a university student, you're doing English. Okay, let's read from page 286 of the Little Red Book. You didn't do anything that you were supposed to be doing but you went through that facade for 10 years.
Can you tell us a little bit about the content of the book? Were there any subject matters in there?
No.
No.
No, it's basically teachings,
Just philosophy.
teachings of philosophical
Mao.
of Chairman Mao. Chairman Mao said, you know, it is precipitous to work hard all day for the mother country. Things like this. If you don't give completely of yourself, you are failing your country. And so so if you want one of those books, go to any stand around any of the sites, they're hawking little red books there. You can get them in German, you can get them in every language. They're still for sale all over the place. But why that's important is that these individuals were put into positions of authority based upon the degrees that they supposedly received during that 10-year period. And how I intersected with that was my work with teachers. So in the 90s, when I was doing teacher training, one of the things they first brought me there for was they had transitioned from teaching British English into American English. And so they're wanting to do some of the differences between British English and American English. And I was doing some of that, but I noticed very quickly, you know, that blank stare when you're talking, and then you slow down, and you still see that blank stare, and then you simplify, and you still see that blank stare, and then you started to classify, and it was based upon age. And you could see that the students, the teachers, who at that time were about 45 and older, were teachers that were at university, high school and university during the Cultural Revolution. They didn't know a lick of English. But they're teaching English to students in China. And so this is one of the things that you have to deal with the government in China. But you can't, as the government in China, admit that government failed. No, these are qualified people, so that they have to be given a job. They were not put in key schools, but they're put in schools and they have to teach. And the frustration for the students, as you might imagine, is that they're actually wanting to learn English. And they're able to see English on, at that point, CCTV begins, which is the Chinese television, begins to have English language. Radio has English language. They certainly hear it on music and other areas. And so there was this point where they started to, this dissonance, and they knew a lot more than the teachers. And so that was one of the frustrations. You really saw it very clearly during that time. Flash forward to today, teachers are quite good. Their proficiency is high. They really try to make an effort to get teachers abroad to actually have an authentic experience. That's changed in the last 3 or 4 years because of politics. And that politics is related to who's the center of the world. And there's the beginnings of this sense of, and that goes back to the Camden Conference philosophy. Question of whose century is it? Who needs to be going out to be looking for best practices? So there's some big questions now within pedagogy and discussion and education. I'd show a little demographics. This is a Chinese population in 2019 and United States population 2018. Our population basically would be flat if it were not for immigration, and theirs was flat at about 1.39 billion for 5 years, until about 5 years ago, when the Chinese policies allowed for multiple children to try to bring about societal piece, because there's some difficulty in second generations of one child who's going to be able to have contact with the grandchild. And that is a big thing, going back again to Confucian values. And so there was some great conflict that was starting to happen. So that second child was starting to be allowed, and so the number has crept up in the last 5 years over the 1.4 billion character. But you
Excuse me, can you clarify the X and Y axes there? Just,
yeah,
they're a little hard to read.
Up here is the age from 0 up to 100 plus, and this is the percentage of the population. And so where we sit pretty even until mortality kicks in right around the age of 60, and it sits like looking like almost like the Empire State Building. They have a couple of, here's one child policy, and this is probably going to then in the next 5 years have another step out. This was the period of time right after the Cultural Revolution. Here's the Cultural Revolution. Here's that period of time right at the beginning of the People's Republic. And so that was a great period. And life expectancy is going to go up. And the life expectancy now for a Chinese person is mid-70s, 75. So it's actually within about 3 years of American. Whereas I think it was the low 60s in 1990. So that's gone up dramatically in terms of life expectancy. This is Hefei. Let me just point out on the map. Do you see the pointer there?
Yes.
Hefei is right here, which is about 400 kilometers west of Shanghai, which is the biggest city in China. And Hefei is a capital of Anhui province, which is an old and troubled province. It's kind of the center point between east, west, north, south. And so with all the internal wars of China, they all went through there. So they've had their periods of difficulty over the years. And there's some interesting things about it because they have both northern Chinese culture and southern Chinese culture, east and west. So it has some interesting parts to it. On the right is kind of the municipality of Greater Hefei. And this was, when I first started going there, this was Hefei. And it was less than 1 million people, it was about 800,000. And this is in the late 1990s. And now this is considered a municipality. And it's grown, obviously, tremendously. 2018 population approaching 8 million people. And that's what it looks like. Very modern city. And they talk about the official bird of China is the crane. building these skyscrapers. And we've got main population there. Comfortably resting at 1.34 billion and probably declining or holding steady. And a lot of open land. This, when I always bring this Swan Lake 1998 and 2008. First time I went there, the head of the Foreign Office brings me out here and he goes, this is going to be the new city. And what it was this guy in the middle of a rice field working on rice, and that's what it was. And I go, yeah, okay. There it is, 2018, same spot. They started building about 3 years later. And that's what it's like. And it's the municipal city center. And they have basically 3 city centers. And that one's about 2.5 million people live there in that part of the the city. The goals and the mission, as by the latest, in China, under the socialist policy, has 5-year plans. And their goals and missions, you know, are pretty general, not very different from what you might see in an American school. But the first is literacy, and they always was really focused on literacy. And I'd say that's really true throughout history because of the, you know, you talk about the examination system and the ability to communicate to all the provinces through the written word, because all the dialects, they couldn't speak to each other because the words were so different, but the written word was the same. But you're up to 97%, and if you're below the age of 50, it's virtual 100%. Mathematical proficiency is very important, and it's applied mathematics. It's different than our system in that they scaffold mathematics simultaneously, meaning that you don't have an algebra year followed by a geometry year followed by a trig year or something like that. You're scaffolding them and applying them together in an integrated way. And so in that applied mathematics, I would argue that it provides a really good foundation for understanding, and it makes for an ability to do some upper level math. 3 and 5 are really important in terms of Mr. Flagg over there, and that's the citizenship and socialization. The school is used very clearly as a method to promote nationalism and to promote the government. You have a class in the high school which is called government, but if you ask the students, they first, in their innocence, go, "Oh, we have propaganda class." They just call it that, straight out, because it's platitudes, things that you must do. You are selected if you are a good student to become a young pioneer, which is like our Boy Scouts and Girl Scouts. But that is to show your nationalist zeal, and you know, it's a precursor to potentially being then selected as a member of the Communist Party. And that's done through the schools. Talent identification and support. If you have specific talents in an area, that's tried to be identified. You know, like if you're in kindergarten, you go through all of your, you know, PE, what's your flexibility, what's your jumping ability, and if you're off the charts, you might suddenly be going to a school that promotes your athletic ability. Same in artistic types of things, but the big one is academic. And you are tested and tested, and it's basically the whole school system is a pyramid scheme, which is forcing people to try to get to the top. Socialization. Classroom is structured around, you don't have different classes in high school. You have, your class is the same people that you're with all day for 3 years. The teacher comes in, and the classes, the boys and girls are ranked within that class. So there's the head boy and the head girl in the class, and then there's the people that are known as you were the bad student, and so there's this socialization within that class, and certain less than positive socialization happens around that. And if you think about it, when I talk to why do people come to the United States, here's some of the reasons why some students eventually might come overseas. Okay. Job preparation. If you don't make the test into the 10 to 12 college track or junior college track preparation, you will go into it's a 1.5 year job training. Then you will be in the workforce at age 16 or 17. And that's probably over half of the students. They don't talk about that part much. but that's happening. And then obviously university preparation and identification. And that characters there is the Gaokao, which is the single test that's taken at the end for everybody. And that determines if you get into a university and which university you get into. You don't apply to the university. Your test determines which university you get into. Structure, very similar in some ways to ours of 50 years ago. K to 6 primary, 7 to 9. Used to be the old junior high school, the junior middle school, university colleges, private school, international schools, overseas. Key schools are schools that you take a test because you don't go to schools by geography after junior middle school. You take a test, and if you get a high enough score, you're able to go to different ranked schools. And so the key schools in any city are going to be number 1, number 6, and number 8. Because those are lucky numbers. So you'd think it would be number 1, 2, and 3, but it's not. These are the 3 lucky numbers. And then the 4th one would be 1, 6, 8. So those are the key schools you want to get into. And those are primarily based upon your scores that you get. Though there are back doors. And the back doors can be party membership. They can be guanxi, which is corruption. I didn't say that, but that's what happens sometimes. So you have a small bit of that. But primarily that group is getting. In the key schools, 90% of those students will go to 4-year universities. The next level, it's less than 50. The next level is less than 10%. So it drops very quickly. So you have very much this pyramid pushing the kids to the top, which is so different from our community schools, where we have comprehensive schools. Every community has the full range of students. Every community is pushing kids and stratifying the kids, which is ironic in a socialist country. Is extremely stratified. And then the curriculum, which I talked a little bit about before, not hugely different than our curriculum, except that the 2 things I would talk about were the mathematics before, integrated math, and the science is integrated as well. Biology, physics, and chem are not taught as discrete subjects, but are scaffolded together. And again, when we see the kids coming across, the preparation and the foundation, because of that scaffolding and integration, is noticeable. So that's food for thought in our education in terms of preparation. And here's just a picture of what a classroom looks like. These are junior middle schoolers, I think 7th and 8th graders. And typical classes are basically 50 to 70 students in size, in a room a little smaller than this. And they're stuffed in there, as you see, partnered with 2 at a table, dum, dum, dum. And that's how you hold. There's a certain way you raise your hand. You don't raise your hand like this. You have to put your hand down like this. There you go. That's the hand. Everything is very structured. Both of these are young pioneer days. They have their scarves on for the young pioneers. So, again, they stay in here all day. The teacher comes in. So the English teacher comes in there. The math teacher comes in there. The Chinese teacher comes in there. They stay in the room. Because it'd be utter chaos to have them try to move around. In each class, each school, you may have, okay, it's grade 9 to grade 10, class number 24. So there may be 25, 26 different classes in each grade level. In Hefei number 1, they have 7,000 students in the high school for 3 grades. 6 and 8, I think, are approaching that as well. K-12 in their school system is 1 million students. 1 million students in their school system.
In one school system?
Yeah. 1 million students. Which is a funny story because I take them around to bring some of the leaders, and I brought the education director to a school, and this woman was very haughty, and she thought she was very important. She was the head of school for about 500 students. And so she sits them down and she talks about, I have a very important job, and talks on and on and on. And I'm responsible for the lives of these 550 students. How many students are you responsible for? And so these 3 or 4 people get together and they start calculating. And then the English person goes, 1 million. And she goes, how? How? And that was the end of the conversation. You didn't want to talk about it anymore. So I thought that was cute. That was very cute. And it speaks so much to some of the challenges, the big challenges of Chinese education, big challenges of China in all areas is scale. Scale. If you're talking about environment, if you're talking about government, if you're talking about infrastructure, if you're talking about resource, if you're talking about scale. If you're talking about somebody that wants to have a middle-class dream of a car, that means in Hefei they add between 15 and 20,000 new cars on the road every month. What does that do to the infrastructure of the roads? I mean, all of these things just build on themselves. Very much foresight, a lot of foresight in terms of sustainable energy, a lot of foresight in trying to use alternative subway systems, buses, all of those sorts of things, but you also have personal aspiration. I want that freedom to do what I want to do when I want to do it. And those things run counter to scale. They run counter sometimes to scale. So, questions. I've been happy to answer any questions about any type of things.
Okay, the obvious question here, to me, seemed, how much would you recommend that the U.S. education system import?
I would recommend pedagogically very little, because it's a big end, single test system, and what they're trying to do is to get away from that. They're trying to get away from that gal cow. What I do think that the United States would benefit from is the idea of not having our education system so siloed. They are more integrated within the sciences, within the humanities, than we are in mathematics. And we want to split them into these distinct parts, instead of keeping them integrated and having those connections being made. We don't teach it that way. And so that's one of our problems. And so the kids look, I'm in biology class now, why would I want to know about chemistry? Instead of, you gotta know about chemistry in order to know about biology. It's going on all the time in our bodies. Same thing with physics. And, and going same thing with the mathematics. And that's why I would say argue in history. You got to know about what was happening in China to understand what was happening in the United States. All of these things need to be a lot more integrated. But sometimes we in our education system fall in love with post-secondary education and specialization, and it trickles down. And AP does that a little bit, and all of these kind of feed that a little bit. do have that lack of integration, and I think that that's a positive. Pedagogically, having 60 people in a room with a teacher-centered, it's terrible, particularly for second language acquisition, because the kids never have the opportunity to speak, and they're not an opportunity to have authentically communicate. And that's one of the things we really, I spent a lot of time working, making a big room into a small room. How do we make this in small groups? How do we get them to authentically communicate around a question as opposed to a rote dialogue and returning that? And so that's what we work on.
When the students that come here go back to China, how are they accepted and how do they contribute to the country if they do?
Good question. And the students of this generation, it's going to be interesting. Because I think the students of 10 years ago, the students of 5 years ago, the vast majority stayed here and didn't go back. But you're beginning to see this cross-pollination and setting up business is the advantage of having connections here and then using those connections with family. And some families are actually, not cynically, but are intentionally trying to set up connections and relationships in the States with their businesses that they have in China. And that's something that's changed. You're also starting to see a decline in interest in coming at this level in secondary and in college. But the interest is still there for graduate school. The graduate school is the place, this is the place to be for graduate school, particularly in the sciences.
Does the educational system in China provide the students coming to graduate school a different outlook on and from a student that would graduate from, say, Lincoln Academy or college like Jason Bowden or do they have any kind of
Advantage?
No,
there's some problem. It is some difficulty. What they end up coming here is actually as postdocs. So I have a very good friend whose daughter is getting her PhD at USTC, which is the China's MIT. And she's going to get her PhD, and she's doing something way beyond which I would even read it, like with stem cell stuff. And she's going to come and do a postdoc here. And one of the reasons she's doing the first one in China is that she's able to do the research there because she couldn't do it in the US because of the restrictions in the United States with law having to do with stem cell.
Having to do with what?
Stem cell. And they're able to do that. And it's looking particularly with using stem cell for cancer prevention and cancer cure.
My view of China was that it was rote learning, but again, if you've got 70 kids in a classroom, obviously there's not a lot of room for discussion, and so is it even now rote learning that goes right towards that exam, even if they're crossing biology and chemistry?
Yeah, but it's rote in an integrated way.
Yeah.
But they're trying to, and what's happening in the Gaokao is that they're starting to shift to a free response in answers. And so that's happening from the top down. And so actually I'm kind of involved a little bit in crafting questions, which would be free response questions that would then not be a rote type of answer in the English area. Because what they're trying to do, and they see this and recognize in their own system, is the lack of development of critical thinking skills.
Right.
And they're trying to develop that and promote that within their examination system.
We have a son who teaches computer science at a U.S. university and consequently sees a lot of Chinese national students. And he says one feature of them that stands out is that they have a propensity to cheat, which he attributes to having been in this cutthroat educational system in China, and all his students have that propensity, but especially the Chinese ones, he thinks. And he will tell them that in computer science it's very easy for him to detect plagiarism or the appropriation of another's works, but they just go right ahead and do that. Is that a fair assessment or a common assessment?
And it's a complex thing. Yes, they cheat. And they cheat a lot. But if I were to go back to this, socialization. Who's top dog? You feed the top dog. And sometimes you give the answer to the top dog. And that's kind of happens because it's not necessarily, and that's where education is not an individual journey, it's a community journey. And it just takes me back, Deb, to Elliot Pope, when we had the student and said, you cheated, here's the same thing. And the kid said, I was doing my job. I had to do this. We're going to throw you out of school. No, that's okay, but I had to do this because this kid's the top kid. And so there was this Confucian kind of rank order thing going. So yes, there are a couple of things that are involved in that. Nationalism's involved in that. There's, for example, the SAT will not test in China any longer. They pulled out of China because of rampant cheating. They will do it in Hong Kong, so people have to go to Hong Kong to do the SAT. They did the LSAT there, they put a camera up, and here was the teacher in the front of the room giving all of the answers. It was the teacher doing it. And again, it's a socialization around group things. So it's not just an individual character thing. It's complicated. So do they cheat? Do they have a propensity to cheat? Yes. Is it because of an individual character thing? Yes and no. There's some other things going on. Yes.
Kind of a related question. In the current climate in this country of isolationist movement, have you seen any evidence on the part of Lincoln Academy or other secondary institutions, and particularly higher ed, college or graduate schools, being more wary of admitting Chinese kids for fear of this whole intellectual property stealing thing that's out there, and also just for giving them ultimately an advantage over us as the primary power in the world? In other words, has there been any pushback in the educational circles to those concerns that you've seen?
No, and speaking for Lincoln Academy, I would say that we see this as a huge advantage of having Chinese students and Vietnamese students and Kazakh students and German students and Danish students, all of the students, because one thing we are deprived of in Mid-Coast Maine is diversity. And to be able to provide these opportunities for different cultures, different ideas within our campus, this is a very rich opportunity. And so we look upon it as a great advantage in the gifts that they're able to provide. And I think vice versa. You know, the stereotypes that get broken down both ways, you know, is amazing. some assumptions about China. Who are our three kids? We have res kids that go to church on Sunday morning, and the assumption would be that the European kids would be the ones who would go to church. Who are the 3 kids that go to church in the morning? Are the Chinese kids. They go down the hill, and they're very involved with the Second Congo Church. So those things break stereotypes within the community, not just at Lincoln, the student body, but also within the community as well. And I would also invite anybody just to come up, at times when we have to meet the kids. They're great kids, they're great young individuals, and they're very open and really wanting to share. Same is true in Bowdoin, and I speak to that from having been a student, but also been a parent of 2 kids that went there in the last 10 years. Bowdoin looks for that same sort of diversity. Whereas at Harvard, everybody in China wants to go to Harvard. So Harvard gets 10,000 applications from China for maybe be able to take 40 or 50 kids. But Bowdoin, because the idea, it's a university is the key word. College is seen as this, it's a 2-year school that no one ever goes to. And so when I say, this is one of the top schools in America, they go, it's a college, we don't want to see it. And I'm like, wait a minute.
I just want to tell you something. I'm a Bates grad. My daughter went to Bates, and they were the first students into China in 1979, I believe.
Awesome. And so, which school?
Bates.
No, which school in China? Sorry.
Oh, they didn't go to a school. They went as
visitors.
Yeah, right. They traveled around.
Oh man, and that must have been an awesome.
It was. I mean.
My folks went there in 1981 on sabbatical, and wow, it was just like staring at the level you would believe.
We have run out of tape, so let me get a round of applause. Thank you, Carl. So, I mean, we can certainly continue with questions. And Karen had